I acknowledge the Cabral people of the Darug Nation as the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm broadcasting tonight. I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woi Wurrung, and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land from which our guest is joining us. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present. Hi, my name is Stephen Pham, and I'm the current facilitator of Express Media's Toolkits Nonfiction program. We're joined tonight by the phenomenal Mia Nie. So, hey, Mia.
Hi.
Mia Nie is a Chinese-Australian comic book artist, zine maker, and internationally award-nominated ex-poet. She has been published in Penciled In, The Suburban Review, Comic Sans Journal, Strange Horizons, and Castles in the Sky. Her work explores the complexities, contradictions, and deeply felt desires of transgender subjectivity. She's passionate about understanding queer history and imagining queer futures. In 2020, Mia received the Wheeler Center's Next Chapter grant to commence work on her first graphic novel. Did you want to give a shout out to the name of that work in progress, or no?
Work in progress? Yeah, it's called NonSarah Dreaming. Keep your eyes peeled.
NonSarah Dreaming. Keep your eyes peeled. You can find her on Twitter at girlwithhorn. Yeah, so thanks again for joining us, Mia. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly talk about the program. Toolkits is an intensive 12-week course for writers under 30. It's run by Express Media, who publish VoiceWorks, run the Tracks program, and are generally the go-to resource for young writers around Australia. Toolkits is a free, digitally based program, so anyone with an internet connection in Australia can take part. This season covers graphic narratives, fiction, and nonfiction. Applications for the second season open in July, which will cover playwriting, digital storytelling, and poetry. And if you're interested in learning about any of these, but you didn't really have the time, money, or ability to attend physical classes, I'd encourage you to apply because Toolkits is for you. And finally, I'd like to shout out the noted Magenta Sheridan, who's behind the scenes tonight, making sure that this night runs smoothly. All right, give me 1 second. All right. So tonight we're chatting to Mia about research and nonfiction. So what is research? How do you do it? How can you use research to transform your writing? Hey, I spent 6 hours on this. Don't laugh. You're not allowed to laugh.
Okay.
If you'd like to ask any questions, you can tweet them with hashtag capital E, capital M, Toolkits, or pop into the YouTube chat. We'll try to work them into our conversation, or we'll answer them towards the end. And I was supposed to start a timer. Boop, boop. Cool. Cool. So, Mia, how are you going tonight?
I'm well, thank you very much. How are you?
I am good. I'm excited.
I would like
to learn what research is. So
let's talk about that.
Let's get into it.
Yeah. The opening question that you asked is what is research, right? And I guess how it fits into nonfiction, because
I guess before that it's probably a good idea to talk about what even nonfiction is in the first place.
Right, sure.
So yeah, so I've had a bit of trouble thinking about what nonfiction is. It's in the term nonfiction, right? It's everything and anything that isn't fiction, which is really, really broad, frustratingly so, unproductively so
broad.
sometimes.
And
yeah.
It's also problematized by fiction's very vague definition as well.
Well, yeah. How would you define it?
I think my opinion on nonfiction is that it's less about what it is in relation to form. So I think nonfiction isn't necessarily a formally distinct thing from fiction writing. I think it's more about sort of the contract / expectation that the reader holds when they're interacting and interfacing with the work. So when you're reading a work of fiction, the sort of implicit expectation is that like this is in the imagination of the writer, right? Whereas nonfiction, it's operating by the like contract and the sort of like mutual understanding that the writer is supposedly writing about something that is true, right?
Yeah.
But that idea of like truth and the degree to which something can be truthful is, I think, where it starts to sort of like starts to get mixed up and a bit problematic.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like how I think about nonfiction, which is that I don't really think about it in terms of nonfiction.
Yeah.
I think about it more in terms of like, what is the experience for the reader interacting with something, given that it's like being presented as nonfiction? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what would the experience? So what do you mean by like the experience of the reader in reading nonfiction as opposed to fiction then?
So I think it depends on the nature of the nonfiction at hand, right? But for example, if something is autobiographical, right? That's a very common, popular form of nonfiction writing. The contract there is that the author and the character that's the protagonist at the center of like the piece of work is the same person, that the author is like writing about themselves, right? And that there's like sort of like a one-to-one like correspondence between like the authorial self and like the sort of like fictional or like constructed like literary self, right? But that's not actually true, right? Those are actually separate entities. Like nobody is ever 100% fully truthful when they're writing about themselves, right? Because you can't be. Like number one, it's just too complicated. Like life is just like way too chaotic. Number two, it often makes for like worse stories. For one, actually, that's like that's maybe another different. Number one, number two makes for worse stories. Number three, you've already begun to sort of like narrativize and fictionalize like the context of your own life when you begin to recall it. So the act of remembering it in itself is a kind of like fictionalization, right? Our memories are fuzzy. Like that's like very much how they work. Yeah, and especially when you're trying to turn it into like a literary construct, you're often going to be running into places where like you are, whether consciously or not, filling in the blanks with like imaginative sequences.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like for me, I think the word truth is even like just such a slippery thing as well, right? Yeah, the word truth. So like thinking about trying to distinguish it from fact, but really I always feel like that's just me sort of just like using words to like slip out of like moral and ethical conundrums and just being like, no, it's fine. It's fine. I can live with myself.
Right.
But yeah.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
For me, when I think about nonfiction,
my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, like for me personally, it is kind of a meaningless term-ish in a way, in the sense that I only ever use it if I'm doing grant applications or submitting for a prize, like, and then like, it's more like for me, just going like, what are the legal implications of this? Will I get sued? And so, yeah, sort of like watching out for myself in that sense, but like the practice of it, it's just like, I feel like good writing is just good writing. Good storytelling is just good storytelling. And yeah, that's pretty much it, that's it for me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think now this discussion is sort of, I guess, moving into more of thinking about it in terms of form and in terms of like craft. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think, I care about craft as it turns out. So
I know that.
There's no smooth way to transition into this, but I've written a whole document with heaps of questions, and I'm just gonna proceed.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about your sort of like, I mean, like you sort of work across poetry, comics, personal essays, I would say fiction, as well. So I wanted to talk about sort of like your essay comic, Lone Shadow.
Yeah, sure. So
Yeah.
firstly, I want to say that I don't write in poetry anymore. That is
Okay.
slander.
Ex-poet.
Very
Ex-poet.
strictly informed ex-poet.
In solidarity, I don't understand poetry. I refuse to.
Yes, famously, Stephen.
Lone Shadow. So like, and thinking about this, I guess as a sort of comic personal essay, and thinking about it in terms of, I don't know, it's like you mentioned before that like life is a bit too chaotic, but I feel like the way that you sort of like, I mean, okay, so here's the summary of like, I guess Lone Shadow for anyone who hasn't read it yet. So the narrator undergoes sort of like hormone replacement therapy, I think. Yep. So they're beginning that, and that's sort of like interrupted by the outbreak of COVID. And she sort of starts playing the video game Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and reflects on gender, performance, bodies, ways of being, among so many other things. And it's like, I don't know, there's this real seriousness to it. And there's also this like intense playfulness to all of it as well. And so like, I'm bringing it back to what you mentioned about life being too chaotic to tell an actually quote unquote true capital T representation of it. But I feel like, I don't know. So like in Lone Shadow, the narrator is like constantly interrupted. Like at one point she gets a phone call from the gender clinic and she has to just like stop her narration to take the call and just be like, oh, and like she sort of like finds out this devastating news that like, I guess the appointments have been suspended until further notice. And I don't know. And it also like, it references sort of like Sarah Ahmed and Judith Butler, and they all come with their own personas, and it's just like this really playful, this interplay between like just dead seriousness and like tragedy and, existentialism, and just this real sort of like, life's a performance. So I don't know. I think that you've incorporated so much research into it. And I kind of wanted to ask, like, what does your research process look like in general?
Right, sure, no worries. So hold on, give me 1 second. Yeah, so thank you for that very comprehensive and glowing review of my comic. That's very kind, Stephen. Yeah, so I guess, so the question is about research, right? With that particular one, I set out to write something autobiographical. And so it is about me, although it is obviously like a fictionalized version of me. And I do like directly talk about that in the context of the comic, because I also wanted to make something that was about autobiography. When I first started writing it, it was a much drier version of itself. So the delivery wasn't anything like the way that it is now, or that it ended up, right? And it was basically just like a lot less playful, a lot more just like directly what it was about, and a lot more, I guess like a traditional autobiographical comic. And I got maybe about halfway through it, and it was just terrible. It was really, really, really bad. Yeah. And so I really had to rework the whole thing tonally and formally and stylistically from the ground up. So basically, I just started thinking about works that I wanted to reference. And that's kind of like my fallback for when I don't know how to do something, is that I try to find somebody else who does something similar better than me. Because writers are extremely intelligent, and most of the problems that I encounter have already been solved, and probably were solved like at least 40 years ago. So there's definitely like a wealth of different solutions to problems that you encounter. And the problems are usually like, well, how do I make something good? How do I make something interesting and readable? How do I make it sort of say something interesting or like say it in an interesting kind of way. Yeah, but I think in terms of my personal sort of like my personal research practice, I think about it in terms of there's like ambient and there's active research. Maybe I had a different, better word for that. Ambient and directed, I think, is what I told you last time, right? During our preparation sessions. Yeah, so I think about research a lot of the time in terms of like ambient research, which is just like the research that you are acquiring throughout your general life, the things that you read, the things that you talk about with your friends, the things that you think about, write about in your diary, etc. And then directed research is like when you have a problem in a piece of writing that requires some kind of glue to stick together. Sorry, what was the question?
No. Just
right.
Yeah, cool. At the end,
Sure.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, keep going. Yes.
Cool. Very sweet. What was I saying? Ambient directed. Directed research is like when you have a problem in a piece of writing that you want to address, that you want to solve, and you're going out and seeking out solutions to find out like, oh, how do I actually do this? What is the glue that I need, both like, formally and conceptually, to actually like stick it all together? Yeah, and so that kind of distinction, I don't think about it very actively necessarily, but when I talk about my research practice, that's very much how I describe it, and that is, I think, true. That's not like a made-up thing. I feel confident in saying that is how I sort of like conduct my own research.
Yeah, and it's less about being like, oh, I'm going to go out and conduct ambient research today or whatever. It's more just about like living life and just noticing things, enjoying things, just being in the moment, etc. And like sort of like, I mean, yeah, and also like just being unafraid to incorporate sort of like your influences in terms of like what you consume on a daily basis and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
And
and I tend to wear my influences on my sleeve like a lot of the time. Lone Shadow in particular was strongly influenced by Scott McCloud and his
old Scotty.
What up, Scotty? Old mate Scotty boy. Terrific. Understanding comics and making comics and so on, right? I mean, Scott McCloud is just like very good at using the form of comics to talk about the form of comics, right? I wanted to do something similar with essentially Autobio. I wanted to use the form of like Autobio comics to talk about the form of Autobio comics. So that's what I was like really attempting to do. And also there's this comic that my friend Marlo, who is a very, very, very genius comic artist, for Advice Comics years ago. Yeah, no, he's so
freaking smart.
He's just so good.
Anyway, yes, his comic.
Yeah, he made this comic for Advice Comics, which is like a Tumblr previously curated by Caroline Anderson. I don't know if she still does, but he wrote this like really fantastic comic that essentially was my stylistic reference point for like really how to talk about something in that kind of like way, right? So those were like my stylistic influences. But then in terms of like the like research that occurred in the making of that comic, it was like concurrently, it was the fact that like I was locked in COVID. I was literally having these experiences. So I was like, I have a history of video game addiction, and then like I started playing games again during COVID because I had nothing else to do, essentially, but also for all the other reasons that I sort of outlined, right? And they weren't strictly true. Like I don't strictly believe everything that I actually said in the comic. Like I do lie in my own work a lot, because that's the best part about being a writer is that you just get to lie. You get to lie for a living.
People pay you to lie.
Yeah, which is why I qualify when I do actually like think that something that I say is true. That these things were happening to me, and then I was wanting to sort of think about them in a more active way, right? And think about and like reflect upon like identity and experience and sort of like constituted selfhoods and everything like that. And then there was like the theoretical component, and that was I mean that's mostly just because like I do a lot of reading. and both like because I want to be a writer, so I think it's necessary to do that. But also because I go to university, I'm doing a master's degree, so like some of the reading that I quoted was mandatory. Others was just like generally, I guess, like trying to form like a politics and like a conception of self, sort of like ambient kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, and also like I guess just really quickly to sort of like I guess maybe summarize, like you've sort of mentioned two kinds of reading, in terms of like reading stuff for the stuff it says, basically, for the content, which I think is what people generally think of when you think of research. Like you go and read a book regardless of the author, you read things about the topic, sort of versus this other type of, I guess, directed research about form, about nonfiction, about sort of looking at, you mentioned like Scott McCloud with the sort of like essay comic,
totally.
and Marlowe, and sort of like looking at, rather than what they say necessarily, looking at how they say it and seeing how you can sort of incorporate that,
And I'm shameless about it as well, and I think that everybody should be. Just pill for it. Just pill for the structure, pill for the style, go for it.
No one cares, and if they do, they're richer than you, so they shouldn't care. It's fine. I wanted to sort of go into the companion essay to You Defeated. To Lone Shadow. So it's an essay called You Defeated, which is an essay on grief, video games, specifically Dark Souls, and sort of trans phenomenology. Again, among so many other things. And you've already sort of touched on this with Lone Shadow, but I kind of wanted to talk about how research sort of shaped this essay. Like in the process of redrafting, right? And sort of like, what was that first draft like? How did you know what was missing? And how did your research influence the re-edits?
Yeah.
Redrafting.
Absolutely. So I guess for context, I am primarily a comic artist and not an essayist. I like to write for myself. And I used to be a prose writer as well. I used to write like short stories, like fiction, which we have already established is a problematized term.
Very smart. We are very intelligent.
Oh, so clever. I love having the biggest brain in the world.
Yeah. All right. Cool.
First moving on. But anyway, so this essay took me like 6 months to write. So it's not. My point is that it's not a regular practice for me to be like writing personal essays like once every 2 months or so. That was my big work, like my big sort of prose work of 2020, and I'll maybe do one this year. So I'll probably write like one essay a year essentially. That isn't for school. Although this one like ended up being for school, but I started it as a sort of personal project. So the history of that one was initially it actually started as a Tumblr post, believe it or not. I don't think I've actually ever talked about this. It's still in my archives. If you go back through my gaming Tumblr or like my ex-gaming Tumblr, you can still see like the basic skeleton of like that original essay. Or at least like a sequence of it that I ended up sort of like a shocking amount of it actually made it into the final one, the final version of that piece. But it was basically just like not jotting down thoughts because I read an essay by AVB, who is a games developer and a games writer. And she wrote this essay back in 2015. It's called "I Love My Untouchable Virtual Body." It's about Bloodborne, but it's very much like using video games and sort of like thinking about video games in this kind of like abstracted, conceptual way as a means to talk about like your relationship, like with your body and with other people, and with like relationality in general, right? And I think like that core premise was like so compelling to me that I was like, I want to do that. Yeah, so that was like where the essay started. The original draft, I think, was very different. All that stuff about Sarah Ahmed and like queer phenomenology, it just wasn't there, because I essentially had not like read into that at that point in time. Like I knew what phenomenology was from like undergraduate studies, but I never actually like read Heidegger. I never read like Ahmed. Yeah, so that's not what the essay was about. It was a much straighter delivery of like just those two threads of like video games and like kind of my life. But I wasn't even talking about my life specifically. I was talking in like very general terms because I was also interested. I think my main impetus for like beginning the project was to try to figure out like, well, why do trans women especially love Dark Souls? This is like a very notable phenomenon. If you know like a number of transgender and transsexual women who play games and are nerds, I think Dark Souls is something that comes up, and it's something that trans girls are sort of like notorious for being really into. Obviously not a monolith, whatever. But I am one of those women.
Yeah. And it's just like a really simple question like that drives such, I mean, how many words did it clock in at?
Like wanting to like really think about like the relationship between like game experiences and virtual experiences and like transgender experiences and just like life in general, right? Like why I connected to it and why I thought maybe other people might as well, right? But again, a lot of it, like in Lone Shadow, was not like it's not necessarily stuff that I like actually swear by, right? It's just like it was an artistic and literary device, or like a sort of opportunity and like
an excuse,
essentially a porthole into being able to talk about like these different things. Yes. But essentially I wrote that first draft. I published it as a zine, and I wasn't happy with it. I just felt like it was missing something. Like I didn't feel like conceptually it was going far enough. I didn't feel like I was actually saying what I wanted to say. And that's partly what the essay is about anyway. It's about sort of like the failure of language. And like it's about like, expression and like inexpressiveness. And like not being able to sort of like say the things that you actually mean and things that you actually want to say. But I wanted to be better, so I really pushed at it. And then during the redrafting process, I started reading some of Sarah Ahmed for class again. So that was kind of like, that began as kind of like an ambient research, for going back to that sort of like ambient directed model of thinking about research. So that was like something in my life that ambiently came up, and it provided like a really good theoretical framework for me to incorporate into the essay. And then I did. And then it became research when I started really, really, really reading into it. So, I read the entirety of queer phenomenology, and then I started reading like a lot of the references as well. So like I read the work of other phenomenologists like Heidegger, and people who wrote about Heidegger and, like post-Heideggerian scholars, like really trying to like understand it. And then sort of take my own liberties with like the core premise of it in order to like create a literary construct. But yeah, I wanted to gain like a good understanding of like the ideas there. So that was like one part of it. The other part was like when I started writing it, I realized that I needed to be more specific when I was talking about like experiences such as like, my friend passing away, the history with my mother. So that was more of like, I really had to sit down and like plumb my own sort of like life and like my own memory for like things that for like those sequences. Yep. I think that's the answer, basically. And then by by the end of
Yeah.
it, I felt like I arrived at a good point. Like I felt like it covered enough ground and that it went deeply enough that it sort of satisfied my
Yeah.
itch.
We have a question from Twitter that I think you actually
Mhm.
answered sort of in passing.
Mhm.
So the question is, in terms of the more formal forms of research, what
Mhm.
are some good resources? Like, and I think that you really touched on that sort of like with the
Right.
daisy chaining sort of thing of like,
Yeah,
you know,
totally. Yeah.
you read a thing and then you read a thing that's referencing, like you read
Yeah.
the reference list and stuff, right?
Yeah,
But
totally. Yeah.
um,
Sorry, go.
no, I was just going to ask further to that, like, do you have any suggestions for anyone trying to sort of like struggling to find a start with their research process? Which is
Yeah,
a very
sure.
broad question.
It is a broad question, but like, I mean, that's what we're here to do, right? That's like
Yeah.
what we're here to talk about. And like
Solve all the
ways of
problems.
conducting research. I mean, I think, I guess we're not really talking necessarily about like academic research here either, right? I mean that there's like, you know, certainly a lot of literature on like how to conduct academic research if you are trying to write academically, and like but just in terms of like your general interest and your general purpose sort of thing, honestly, being on Tumblr is really useful for me.
Yeah.
It's just
Why is
like
that?
that's what.
Why? Why do you say that?
Just because there's like it's just like I just like microblogging, and I follow a lot of people who just like post like thoughts and thinkers, right? So there's like this stream of like sort of thought people of scholars and scholarly people and their writings that's sort of like being beamed into my skull every single day that I'm sort of like spending on Tumblr. Although I try to limit my usage of all social media, not just Tumblr.
Yeah.
But aside from that, if you're trying to make something and you wanted to reference another like piece of work, I think it's just like valuable to just like Google that piece of work and then find the influences of that and then just like keep on following that daisy chain, right? So that's like less academic, or just like Wikipedia link clicking, right? But like that in and of itself is really useful, and it's yielded me like a lot of really good fruit. To just like find out about like more pieces of media that you can look at, to find out like how other people have done it, how other people have like said things, and like what they've said about things, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. I would maybe liken it to like sort of like finding new music to listen to. Like you can kind of do a sort of, you can sort of just like dive in and just be
That's
like,
a really
I'm gonna.
terrific analogy, Stephen. Yeah.
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 You could go into youtubes.com and type music and maybe you'll get like whatever, but I feel like a lot of it is kind of just coincidence, like whatever pops up on your sort of stream, and then you can like dig deeper into that, look at the record label, look who they've collaborated with, etc., and like you basically will eventually you'll find something like that, except I guess in this case it would be like writers that they reference, or like people on the same from the same publisher, people who've written on the same topics, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whew. Okay. Oh man. Yeah, we've got 10 more minutes allegedly. All right, cool.
So, oh my god.
Yeah.
Time is flying by. We have not covered. Okay, let's keep going.
We're going okay, but we can speed run this definitely. All right,
no,
cool.
No, we're fine. Okay, cool.
Yeah, okay. I mean, when you're talking about publishing You Defeated as a zine, the first draft of it, right? And then like you read over and you're like, this isn't good enough. Like I kind of, and sort of like this is like a thing that I guess some of the participants in the Toolkit sort of program have like raised like a concern about like how to self-edit, how to be critical on yourself. sort of,
Yeah.
but then there's this sort of like push-pull between like, you know, what is authentically me versus like
Right.
what is quote unquote good writing, how,
Right.
you know, like and so like I think the question is kind of like, how much should nonfiction writers sort of like care about the audience when they're redrafting, do you know, in
Right.
terms of like evaluating their writing and re-editing and reading it like as harshly as they can, like
Yeah.
how seriously should they care about someone else, sort of like an outside gaze, you know, reading their work? Does that make sense?
Yes. No, I think, okay, so that's kind of a difficult question to answer. It depends on who your imagined audience and who your imagined reader is, and what effect you're actually trying to impart upon them. I think, like, so the question is really like, what the hell am I trying to do in this piece of work? So that's like a much more difficult, like, it's more direct, but it's a much harder like question to answer, right? Yeah, because when you're talking about like considering your reader, it's like, well, what are you considering? Are you considering like their accessibility, or are you considering like trying to make something that's actually like challenging to them? Yeah, that kind of thing, right? So I think that's kind of hard to answer. I tend to think about the reader a lot because like I want my work to be read. And I'm not really writing it for my own sake. I mean, obviously I do, because, you know, I write for esteem, like everybody does. I want to be famous, etc. But but I also do care about the form, and I care about the work, and I think about that a lot. And I think if you think about it like if you think about form as mediated between like yourself and the reader, that's like the middle point that you should be thinking about, right? So you're not trying to think about like, you know, skipping that step of form. You're thinking like, what is the form here? What the hell am I trying to do? What is like the effect to me, and how might the effect like, you know, knock onto other people and that kind of thing. So I think just like treating that like middle ground, you know, that sort of like no man's land, as like the sort of like locus of like your actual sort of like efforts is the key thing. But aside from that, I think that you should be caring about like making your work like interesting and when we say like what good writing is, it's like good is not like a useful sort of like descriptor, right? Use it as a shorthand for like a variety of different things. But like good should be like good can be used to signify like, you know, like is this writing original? Is it fresh? Like, is it formally interesting? You know, it's like, is it exciting? Are there things going on? Like, even when you get in the nitty gritty, it's like, well, how long has it gone before something like since there's been like a shift in terms of like what you're trying to say, like how long is it dragging on, like, you know, that kind of thing. So I think when you start like thinking about it in those terms, and when you start like being more specific and like trying to demystify like what good writing actually is, that tends to be useful for me.
Okay. I mean, I want to clarify the question.
Right.
Sort of, and this is like not exclusive to this cohort. I see it in a lot of sort of like emerging writers, because I guess I've worked with emerging writers for more or less the last 9 years, which is a long time.
God.
Yeah, Jesus. Time. What is it? Anyway. Okay, so like I guess
longer
like
than I've been my gender, Stephen.
Sorry?
That's like way longer than I've been my gender, Stephen.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm old. It's fine.
Whatever.
I mean, you're older than you. You need to show respect.
Oh, true.
All right. Okay, so I guess like, so on one end we've got sort of like Toni Morrison's idea of like, you know, the white gaze, GAZE, by the way, and sort of like this idea that you are writing for a very particular audience, or writing away regardless of, you know, this sort of audience that will take your work in bad faith. And so that gives her writing, you know, so much depth, because she's not afraid to go beyond the sort of like, oh, is this good representation or is this bad representation? It's like, no, it's not about that, you know? It's about characters who are Black, and they are also, you know, like, they can be noble, in love, and courageous, but they might also be like reckless and neglectful or conniving or detached or overzealous, you know, like, and I think that that lack of fear allows Toni Morrison's work to sort of like not showcase even, that's not even the right word, just for her characters to just be human, you know, outside of a world that regularly dehumanizes them, right? And so that's one end of it, to right away from a particular gaze. And so on the other end, I think like, you know, like with the personal essay boom from like 2008, right? At the worst of times, it was just like really cheap drivel that wasn't well edited and didn't even really prioritize the writer's like welfare at all. It was just really exploitative. Of course. It's
a completely exploitative industry,
Yeah. And so like, I don't know, like, and that's sort of like a more recent phenomenon, right? And it's just like, I feel like certain writers feel this conflation between the narrator and writer as if everything is autobiographical, as if like everything they write must be taken, like, is written in earnest at all times. And so that results in this more like less of a carefree or sort of courageous sort of like, I'm going to be human no matter what, and more sort of like a movement towards like willful obscurity, a sort of more defensive position. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. No, you're completely right about that. Yeah. A real trap when you're starting to think about like your writing.
And so like that's what I mean by audience. Like, will they exploit me? How will they read this? Versus like, how can I write something that is interesting and authentic, but not necessarily quote unquote, you know, like fucking I'm legally liable for or whatever, you know?
Right, totally. That becomes liable. I mean, this is going back to like the very beginning, right? When we were talking about like what the distinction between like fiction and nonfiction is. I'm gonna slow down. This goes back to the beginning, etc. When we're talking about the distinction between like what fiction and nonfiction is, right? Where like when you're thinking about yourself, like when you yourself are actually thinking about yourself as like the work, right? As being one-to-one the literary figure that's being presented in the work. That's a trap. like that's like a fast ticket to like writing that doesn't go far enough, or writing that like in danger, right? Or like makes you feel like you're being put in danger. I think like it helps you as the writer to think about yourself as a literary construct, and that gives you like the distance to be able to actually assess like the work and figure out like what it actually needs or doesn't need, right? Because you may be personally attached to something, or you may be personally like afraid to do something, right? But if you think about it in terms of like you are not like what's actually being presented, right? But that is that like you are trying to create something, a piece of work for somebody else to read, that you're sort of like offering something up to them. That's when I think it's easier to think about it in terms of that.
Like sort of I mean, and I don't mean it in a judgmental way. There's so many reasons that you would want to write defensively, or like sort of like like, oh, I'm just gonna write in vague terms and you just have to put up with it. I'm taking up space. That's a radical act. But I guess like for me, I find that the writing that I enjoy most is just quite generous. Like it's an act of sharing almost.
Early.
It's, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a gross way, you know. It doesn't have to be like, oh, here is every single trauma I've ever experienced, you know. Like I actually don't love that, but like
I also
more like that you can tell that a writer cares about you, or cares enough about their craft to make you want to like keep reading and ask questions and engage with it, you know. Like it's that kind of act of sharing that I really value, I think.
And you're talking sort of about like selfish writing versus writing that's sort of like a bit more concerned with like the recipient, right? And I don't think selfish writing is necessarily bad. Like I don't use it as necessarily as a negative descriptor, although there's lots of bad selfish writing, right?
Yeah.
And there's more of a tendency for bad selfish writing to exist, right? But I think like it is fully possible for good selfish writing to exist. Although don't ask me for examples because I will blank.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think. Wait, did you want to mention anything else before we moved on?
I mean, not particularly. I mean, at this point, Yeah. What?
We have 10. About 10 minutes. So yeah.
Yeah, sure, totally. Yeah, no. I just mean, yeah. I think this is essay that I go back to a lot, which is T.K. Ramadin's Against Catharsis, right? Where she's like writing about autobiography, and she really just like talks about it in better terms that I'm able to. So you should just read that to get like my thoughts on it, essentially, right? But that's also where I got the terminology of like this is for you, right? And like sort of this idea of like generosity and like offering to somebody. Yeah, very much talking about like how, or she's arguing against sort of like this impulse to write as in a sort of like therapeutic way, right? And I think that there is like value in like therapeutic writing and in writing as therapy and in art making it therapy in general, right? But I think that like something being therapeutic in and of itself isn't like the be all and end all of the pursuit, right? And I don't necessarily think that it makes good work either. So I think that if you are really invested in becoming like a writer instead of a diarist, yeah, it helps to think about it in those terms. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and also like there are always different purposes for different forms of writing. And like you said, good and bad is not a helpful terminology. It's just shorthand that I personally just use because I'm lazy when it comes to stuff like being rigorous.
I love being lazy. That's why we do this instead of like a trade.
I'm currently looking at TAFE courses, but anyway, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
You're not lazy, Steve.
Okay.
Very hardworking.
Thank you. Let's see. I think we're going to go with one really quick one from this big old document. So I think that emerging writers sort of have this idea, I guess, like this idea of like how precious their voice is, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I wonder, and I feel like that maybe they see too much research as a sort of like corrupting force. And so I want to ask you, like, is there such thing as, like too much quote unquote research? And how can you incorporate research without it like overwhelming your writing?
That's a good question. I just made like a bitchy tweet about like The Voice like 2 days ago, so that's why I was laughing. But my voice. Yeah, I think a lot of people overthink voice. That's like my honest opinion. I think that there is such a thing as overthinking research, but there's not necessarily such a thing as like over researching in the same way that you can't be over-educated. But you can't be like, too well read, essentially. It's really like, it's like when you're overthinking like how to incorporate your research in a one-to-one kind of way. By that I mean like when you're overthinking in terms of like, well, how do I cram every single piece of information from the research that I've done into it that I think is like relevant or that might be good. That leads to bad writing because it's just overcrowded, right? Like you're trying to cover too many bases. And then whatever sort of like original writing that you were researching for becomes drowned out by like the volume of research that you've sort of like created. Yeah, I think that's one way of sort of like over researching is basically just like in the presentation.
Copy pasting entire fucking books. Just a link to the PDF straight up.
Yeah, just link the PDF. It's a book within a book. But that's just referencing, to be honest. That's fine. But but yeah.
I mean, like, what's sort of like a practical? So, like, if someone conducted if someone were referencing something, right? If a writer were referencing, like, like Sarah Ahmed is like, I don't know, The Cultural Politics of Emotion was like just an incredible book to me, and I was like, wow, I can't wait to like talk about her in my writing, and then I would just like paste in like 3 pages of her book into my essay, and I was like, hey, this is a bit too much.
With a writer like Ahmed, who her writing is really good, but also like very, very, very like difficult to excerpt. Very difficult to sort of like extract a sequence without it sort of like falling apart, because she's like so good at sort of like building on and then building upon and building from and so on.
And it's not like she's not just like writing about things. She's
this is becoming the
form reflects it, right? It's like, sorry.
Yeah. This is just the Sarah Ahmed bad chat now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. Oh my god. I wish you were wearing your jumper right now, but it's fine.
Oh my god. How did I mess that up? Jesus.
Yeah, but so like I guess with Sarah Ahmed, she's not just writing about phenomenology. Like the writing that she does, the way that she structures her sentences and paragraphs and chapters and the entire book is just a phenomenological like it just is phenomenology. She's not writing about it. She is writing phenomenology,
Right, totally. Yeah.
I don't know. So is there sort of like a practical way, I mean, for non-Sarah Ahmed references then to cut down on the big blocks?
Not worry too much about like your own voice. I mean, just find a good ratio. I think that's like probably the best way to do it.
Find a good
find a good ratio.
Yeah.
So like find a good ratio of like quote to like, and usually it's like if you are like writing in a sequence where you're like quoting things, it's like 1 to 4 for me. So like for every 10 words worth of a quote, you sort of want like 40 to 50 words, sort of like in your own writing, not necessarily directly responding to it, but like talking about like afterwards, basically, or after sort of like
you want too much indented text all over the place,
totally, although sometimes you want to do that anyway, just sort of like get a point and get your point across, but then like to sort of like establish a kind of like knowledge with your reader and then talk about that in a lot of detail, right? And like really, I think that's one way to do it. But also like I think not overthinking your voice is just like I think pretty important, because like if you're thinking too much about like, well, how do I make this authentic to me? I mean, that's a pitfall. Like who are you? Like what is your voice? Like what is going on?
Who are you?
Like you won't be able to find those answers without actually just like going in there and working on it. And what you just have to do is like you just have to like keep on like working on it. And I think the voice very much is something that emerges during the editorial. And well, actually, no, it emerges throughout the entirety of like the writing process, right? Like your voice can be coming through like as you're sort of like doing your first draft, as you're sort of like having these little flourishes of like improvisational sort of like thought and speech. But 2 questions, great. But also that like your voice is also being like created and refined in the editorial process, as you're sort of like working out like what to add, what to cut, so on. Like that's all part of your voice, right? So basically it. 2 questions.
I just wanted to add one thing real quick. And also you already have a voice. It's fine. Like literally just talk into a recorder about what you want to talk about and then transcribe that. Like you already have a voice. It's fine. Don't worry about it. All right, cool.
And it is something that you have to practice and get better at as well.
You can get better at it.
Like, it's something that you will naturally like uncover, and that every human being in the universe will be able to naturally uncover like as they practice at it, right? Because you have a monologue, you have a brain, you have like an interiority, so like you seem to find it.
It's there. Don't worry about it. You don't even have to find it. It's there. Just don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. All right, cool. We can't keep doing this bit. We've got questions. We're supposed to make time for questions, and we got to make time for questions. All right, cool. First question comes from Samantha Van Zweden. Yes. So this is a great conversation. Right. Thank you both. Thank you, Samantha. I'd like to hear about what your comics practice borrows from essays and what your essay practice borrows from comics.
Great question. I've been thinking about it for the last 40 minutes. And we don't have enough time to cover all of it. So I guess I'll write an essay about it sometime. So what does my comics practice borrow from essays? I think comics and essays do inform each other, like for me, right? I think that when I'm thinking about comics, I'm often thinking about like, what is this actually trying to say, right? Because that's something that like you get a lot more of in essays than you do in comics. You know, when you're thinking about like, well, okay, how do I actually like incorporate sort of like other people's thinking? How do I actually like sort of like begin and then end it and so on? There's like maybe there tends to be less formal convention for comics than there is for essays, and I actually like borrowing from the formal convention of essays to write comics. Like, for example, in Lone Shadow, I started with a personal anecdote before sort of like extrapolating on and all of that, right? And then like going back, like, you know, back and forth between like the personal and like the theoretical. So yeah, that's which you know is a very common sort of like structure in personal essay writing. On the flip side, when I'm writing essays, I really like writing imagistically. When I'm writing prose, I really like having like a strong sense of like the sensorial experience of like, of like light and like visual. And yeah, that's really what I focus on more than sort of like anything else, like when I'm actually writing prose. So I think that's like my answer. Thank you.
Cool. And question from Chris Marks. I'm not going to read it out, so you can talk more, so I can talk less. All right, cool.
Thanks. I always want to make about comics, but I find it difficult to depict my life in an interesting and palatable way for readers. How do you find good framing devices? That's a really difficult question. I'm not sure how to answer that. Chrissy, we can talk about this in private because we live together. So thank you for asking this. This is my housemate.
Love that. Okay. Thanks so much. Thank you so much.
Oh, are we ending it here? Okay, sure.
No, if you really want to quickly answer it.
Yeah,
25 words or less. Let's go.
I find it in an interesting and palatable way for readers. How do you find good framing devices? How do I find good framing devices? It's really just trial and error. You have to like really draft and redraft a lot of it. And yeah, I look at other good autobio work that you enjoy. Think about like what the Stephen, come on, we're in a discussion panel. What are you doing? You can't blow smoke rings. It's fine. It's fine.
Keep going. Trial and error.
Yeah. Trial and error. Find other sort of like, not necessarily autobio, but just like narrative work, you know, things about like people that you enjoy. Think about like how they're done from a formal perspective. And yeah, that's my advice, I guess. You
gotta try. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, etc. All right, cool. We're going to wrap up now. I would love for this to keep going. I wish it had actually gone for 2 hours, although I am also getting hungry, but it's fine. Okay, cool.
I'm really running out of Larynx,
yeah.
So I'm glad that it's ending.
So thank you, everybody, for submitting your questions. Thank you, Mia, for such, I hope, what people will find like really, really like would be like helpful advice and like really practical advice, because that's what I really, really sort of like, you know, I don't know, find really admirable in you, Mia.
Thank you. I think you're really good at it.
Thank you. Yep, so that's a wrap on our second live session for this season of Toolkits Live, literally reading from the dot points now. So this session is going to be available on YouTube as a resource, and it'll be captioned in the coming days. So yeah,
cool.
Come back if you want to revisit any of tonight's conversation. And on Wednesday, 5 May, 6 p.m. AEST, our fiction facilitator, Jennifer Down, will be joined by Kavita Bedford for the next Toolkits Live. Voice recognition, writing dialogue, and crafting narratives. You can tune in on the Express Media YouTube page. One last thing, if you want to check out any of Mia's work, if you want to chuck her a tip, it's gumroad.com/girl-with-horn. All one word. And so thanks for watching and goodbye. And if you're in my class, goodbye. See you soon.